Nash.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. This bill is quite a wide-ranging bill, and the thing around child support didn't actually receive much attention in the Select Committee, but I actually think it's a very important part of the legislation. And we'll take a few calls on this. And part of the reason for this, Mr. Chair, is to put things into perspective. You know, as of the 31st of March 2014, there are actually over 203,000 New Zealand children receiving child support. There are 134,000 receiving carers and 36,000 liable parents. But as has been mentioned, we get to a stage at the moment where child support debt exceeds $3 billion. It is excessive, and it gets to the point where it is just, it's just not payable. And Mr. Chair, I remember one of the first cases I ever had when I became a List MP in Napier in 2008 was a gentleman who came in who wanted to pay child support for his son, but what had happened is his debts had got to such an extent, his penalties, I should say, had got to such an extent that he couldn't see a way through. And what he asked me to do was advocate and say he was prepared to pay what the IRD was asking him to pay to support if he could get away from paying the penalties. We tried, and the IRD wouldn't budge on this. In the end, this gentleman went to Australia because he said he couldn't get a job. Whenever he put his IRD number in, then a good chunk of his salary was whacked out by the IRD in support payments. And that is not the sort of system that is fair. It doesn't help parents, it doesn't help children, and it certainly doesn't help the system in any way, shape or form. But the thing about this, Mr. Chair, and I will get onto the bill in a quick second.
Okay.
Yes, is that the Minister Dunn, as the last speaker alluded to, started a review of this system in around 2008, and I remember I was the revenue spokesperson for Labor at the time. The Minister said it would be over in 12 months. It has taken a long, long time to do this, and part of the reason is because it is fraught with difficulty, because it affects so many people, and the law is quite complex, even though it says it's in the regulatory impact statement that it's not, but it is quite complex. But it took so long to do, to the point where 6 years later, Mr. Chair, we are still going through this whole process. The Act that set up this was a 1991 Act. The world has moved on since 1991, but the legislation hasn't reflected that until now. Let me talk about a couple of points. There's a new Section 13A, and I would say that part of the child support, well, a good chunk of child support is about perception. It's got to be perceived to be fair by caring parents and also by liable parents. And there was a case of actually a high-ranking national minister at this point in time, and I remember talking to this minister, and she told me about her father, who actually managed to put a whole lot of his income through trust and therefore avoided paying child support. He was living the life of Riley, and this minister and her family were living in close to poverty because this man, her father, was managing to avoid his responsibilities, let alone his liabilities. And this is the sort of stuff we've got to change. But there are some things that were perceived to be unfair that have been changed. For example, there's a new Section 13A, which introduces the rule that the Commissioner must refuse to make a formula assessment if the applicant is a non-parent carer of the child and the Commissioner determines that the applicant is the non-receiving carer. Now, let me give you an example of where this was happening before, and again, I dealt with a couple of these. And that was a case where, for example, a gentleman married a lady, and that lady had a couple of kids from a previous marriage. He was perceived in his mind and also in the law to be the non-receiving carer. However, because his income was of a substantial amount, he was forced to pay child support for his wife's children as well as for his own children. And that was perceived in his mind, but also in mine, to be unfair. But let's get a definition of this. A non-parent carer of a child is the receiving carer. So the non-parent carer, we're talking about the stepfather or stepmother usually, as the receiving care for the purposes of a formula assessment in respect of the child if he or she provides at least 35% of ongoing daily care for the child. Now, these definitions are actually quite important because what it does do is it clarifies the increasing role of step-parents in managing the financial relationships between their new wife or husband. Sections 13, 14, 17 and 1722 of the new Act, it basically relates to the calculation of a parent's income for the child support year. Mr. Chair?
Stuart Nash.
Thank you very much. And there are a number of changes here that again just makes it a little bit fairer. If we have a look at clause 14, part 1, a person's adjustable taxable income for a child support year this is the income from the year immediately preceding the start of the child support year, if that is the most recent tax year. Now, I'm dealing with a case at the moment, Mr. Chair, where the IRD has assessed a gentleman's income for about 4 years previous. And this guy has brought in all his IRD slips, and I should talk to the ID about this, brought in all his tax slips saying they're assessing me on an income of $120,000 for the last 3 years. I've earned $50,000. He's not hiding it in trust in any way, shape or form. He loves his kids dearly, but he says, I just can't pay this. He said, at the end of the day, I take good care of my kids, but I simply can't pay it. So what this is doing is it's saying the tax year immediately preceding the year child support is calculated will be the one upon which his payments or her payments are assessed. But if it does not apply the person's taxable income, we go into clause B here, immediately preceding the most recent year inflated by inflation percentage for this child support year. It just clarifies a lot of stuff. Another thing that I'm very happy that we put in here is the Commissioner may take overseas income into account. Because again, what was happening, Mr. Chair, in my experience, is that, let's be honest, it was usually men, but I suppose there were cases where women were avoiding their responsibilities, but it was usually men who were hiding income through trusts or not counting overseas income, etc., and therefore not paying or not living up to their responsibilities. The one thing also that's been mentioned by Grant Robinson, which I think is actually fantastic, and it's something that we mooted going into the 2011 election, is almost having an amnesty. And I remember when I asked the officials in the FEC if in fact this did amount to an amnesty, i.e. if you come in and start paying, not you Mr. Chair, if a liable parent starts coming in and paying their dues, will they be able to write penalties off? And they said, in essence, this is what it is. Because what we want, Mr. Chair, is for liable parents to start paying their penalties. And I remember, and I don't think the stats will have changed, but in 2011, there were about 97% of parents who were operating under the IRD-administered scheme, as opposed to a scheme that is a private scheme negotiated between the parents, who had suffered some form of penalty at some point in time. And that, in the end, Mr. Chair, it is actually not in the best interest of the child if a liable parent is paying, let's say $100 a week, and they're paying $75 of that to child support, but they're also paying 25% of that, or whatever the fee is, to pay off penalties and support. I think we all acknowledge that the ideal situation is all the money that a liable parent is paying goes to the support of the child. And if there is a scheme that can be put in place where in fact penalties can be written off if a parent comes in and comes to an arrangement and starts paying their fair share, then everyone wins, including the IRD, because the bottom line is $3 billion we're talking about actually is unworkable. And I remember having a look at the fees. Even in Hawke's Bay itself, Mr. Chair, there was around about $49 million in penalties and interest they were owing due to child support. And as mentioned, no one wins in that case. That's all I've got to say on this at this point, Mr. Chair, but I'm going to take a couple of calls soon after a couple of my colleagues have decided to have their say. Thank you.